Iridium Communications has decided to use SpaceX as the launch provider for the final batch of its next communication satellites. This will complete the constellation by adding up to 5 additional on-orbit spares. According to the company, SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket will be used to launch those satellites as part of a rideshare mission that will take off from California's Vandenberg Space Force Base, no earlier than the middle of 2023. If you want to know more about it, stay tuned till the end of this video. Iridium and SpaceX have maintained a close working relationship ever since SpaceX's Falcon 9 first took to the skies. In 2010, just a few days after Falcon 9's first successful launch, the company awarded SpaceX a head-turning contract with a total value of almost $500 million for the launch of the entire Iridium NEXT constellation. This contract was led by CEO Matt Desch. The Iridium satellite constellation was conceived in the early 1990s as a means of providing dependable satellite communication services to locations that are geographically dispersed, such as high latitudes on Earth. Initial calculations indicated that 77 satellites would be required. Consequently, the project was given the name Iridium, which is named after the element with the atomic number of 77. It turned out that only 66 were required to finish the job of providing communication services to every part of the planet. Iridium NEXT launches were initiated by SpaceX at the beginning of 2017, marking the company's return to flight after a Falcon 9 rocket exploded on the launch pad just 4 months earlier. Iridium Satellite Systems Corporation was responsible for the development of the first-generation constellation, which was funded by Motorola. The satellites were put into orbit between the years 1997 and 2002. Before a commercial service could begin, it was necessary for all of the satellites to be in orbit. In order to get their 77 satellites into orbit, Iridium SSC used a fleet of rockets that came from all over the world. This fleet included launch vehicles from the US, Russia, and China. 60 satellites were put into orbit using 12 Delta-second rockets with 5 satellites each, 21 Proton KDM-2 rockets with 7 satellites each, 2 Rokot Brisk KM rockets with 2 satellites each, and 6 Long March 2CSD rockets with 2 satellites each. Roughly $5 billion was spent on the initial setup of the first-generation fleet. In 1998, the network successfully completed its first test telephone call, and by 2002, it had reached its full potential in terms of worldwide coverage. However, despite the fact that the system was capable of meeting its technical requirements, it was not a commercial success. The fact that its reception was poor inside buildings, that its handsets were cumbersome and expensive, and that it faced competition from more traditional forms of mobile technology all contributed to its failure. There was not enough demand in the market for the product at the price points that were being presented by Iridium, which had been established by its parent company, Motorola. Iridium was one of the largest companies to ever file for bankruptcy in the history of the United States of America at the time of its failure to generate sufficient revenue to cover the costs of servicing the debt associated with building out the constellation. Despite the initial Iridium Corporation filing for bankruptcy, the constellation was able to carry on with its business as usual. A new company emerged to operate the satellites and developed a different product placement and pricing strategy in order to offer communication services to a niche market of customers who required dependable services of this type in regions of the planet that were not covered by traditional geosynchronous orbit communication satellite services. This allowed the new company to offer services to customers in areas of the planet that were previously inaccessible via traditional geosynchronous orbit communication satellite services. Users can range from journalists and explorers to military personnel and units. Even though the original satellites based on the LM700A model had been projected to have a design life of only 8 years, No new satellites were launched between 2002 and 2017 to replenish the constellation. This was despite the fact that the design life of the original satellites was only 8 years. In January of 2017, Iridium NEXT satellites of the second generation began to be integrated into the previously established constellation. Iridium Communications, the company that will take over operations from Iridium SSC, has placed an order with Thales Alenia Space and Orbital ATK for the construction of a total of 81 new satellites. This includes 66 operational units, 9 on-orbit spares, and 6 ground spares. Iridium made the decision in August of 2008 to invite Lockheed Martin and Thales Alenia Space to take part in the final phase of the procurement process for the next generation satellite constellation. As of the year 2009, the original plan called for new satellite launches to get underway in the year 2014. Iridium stated that the existing constellation of satellites would remain operational until Iridium NEXT is fully operational, with many satellites expected to remain in service until the 2020s, while the next satellites would have improved bandwidth. The design was finished in 2010, and Iridium stated that the existing constellation of satellites would have improved bandwidth. The newly developed system was supposed to be compatible with the currently in place system. Thales Alenia Space was selected as the successful bidder for the contract in June of 2010, and the deal was worth $2.1 billion and was underwritten by the French Company of Assurance for the Exterior Commerce. Iridium also stated that it anticipated spending approximately $800 million to upgrade some ground facilities and launch the satellites. A little over 1.5 years later, SpaceX had successfully completed 8 Falcon 9 launches for Iridium and successfully deployed the entire 75 satellite NEXT constellation in polar orbit, which was an increase from the initial plans for 72 satellites. Now, after what will be a hiatus of joint activities that will last for 4.5 years, Iridium wants SpaceX to launch up to 5 of the 6 remaining NEXT spares. This means that Falcon 9 will likely be responsible for launching all of the satellites in the constellation, with the exception of one. When SpaceX successfully carried out its 8th and final Iridium launch in January of 2019, the communications provider was left with 9 NEXT satellite spares in orbit and 6 spares on the ground. These spares were all prepared to take over or be launched in the event of an anomaly. These satellites, which were manufactured by Thales Alenia Space and cost approximately $2.9 billion to develop and launch, have proven to be extremely dependable. None of the 75 satellites that are currently in orbit have experienced a malfunction close to 6 years after the initial launch. In other words, Iridium is holding off on launching the 6 remaining ground spares because it currently requires them. Iridium's chief executive officer believes that launching those spare satellites now will make the NEXT network even more resilient, in addition to eliminating the cost of storing satellites for an extended period of time. Before the announcement of September 8th, Iridium's earnings reports for the second quarter of 2022 revealed a $35 million contract to launch 5 of the 6 remaining NEXT spares. This contract almost certainly refers to Iridium's 9th launch with SpaceX. Iridium paid SpaceX approximately $8.9 million in 2022 for each of the first 75 NEXT satellites that SpaceX launched. This figure takes into account the effects of inflation. Iridium will pay $7 million for its 9th SpaceX launch, which is a 21% decrease from their previous payment. Iridium signed a non-binding agreement with the startup company Relativity Space in the year 2020 to potentially launch all 6 spares on the 3D printed Terran 1 rocket that the startup was developing. After a delay of 2 years, it would appear that Iridium has come to a significant decision and no longer wishes to be concerned with launching its NEXT spares on an as-needed basis. Terran 1 has a list price of $12 million, but it is only capable of launching one 860-kilogram Iridium NEXT satellite at a time. This means that the total cost of launching all 6 satellites will be at least $72 million. Terran 1, as is typical for new launch vehicles, has experienced many delays. However, Relativity claims that the vehicle could make its debut as early as October of 2022, although it is still possible that Terran 1 will be used to launch the final Iridium NEXT ground spare. Statements made by CEO Matt Desch on Twitter do not instill confidence in the possibility. Iridium appears to have made the decision, in the end, to launch the majority or all of the remaining spares at the same time. By doing so, the company was able to save tens of millions of dollars while simultaneously adding additional redundancy to its communication services. So that's all for today's video. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you want to watch more videos like this one, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so that you will always be notified.